7 killers, each one worse than the last. By level 7, you'll realize the most terrifying truth. The worst psychopath in this series might still be alive today. Level 1. Jodie Arias, Arizona. This psychopath's case became one of the most watched trials in American history, not just because of the brutal killing she committed, but because of the web of lies she spun trying to escape responsibility. Jodie Ann Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California. She grew up in what appeared to be a normal middle-class household with both parents present. In later interviews, Arias would claim her parents were strict and sometimes physically disciplined her, though her family denied these accusations and they were never independently verified. Arias attended Eureka Union High School but dropped out before graduating. She worked various jobs, photographer, waitress, and eventually as an aspiring salesperson for a multi-level marketing company. Before meeting Travis Alexander, Arias had a pattern of unstable romantic relationships. Some former partners described her as intense and possessive, though she had no criminal record. In late 2006, she became involved with Prepaid Legal Services, a multi-level marketing company, which is how she would meet the man who would become her victim. Travis Victor Alexander was born on July 28, 1977, in Riverside, California. His early life was difficult, marked by childhood neglect, but he later found stability living with his grandparents. He became a practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and worked as a motivational speaker and salesman for Prepaid Legal Services. Travis was known for his charisma, discipline, and ambition. Friends described him as someone who had overcome a difficult childhood to build a successful life. Arias and Alexander met in September 2006 at a company conference in Las Vegas. Alexander was immediately attracted to her, and the two began a long-distance relationship. Arias converted to the LDS Church shortly after meeting him and was baptized in November 2006, which initially strengthened their connection. Despite the enthusiasm at the start, the relationship was troubled from the beginning. Alexander's friends reported that Arias became increasingly possessive and jealous. She moved from California to Mesa, Arizona, where Alexander lived, without a clear explanation. After they broke up in mid-2007, she moved again to Eureka, California. But even after the official breakup, the two continued to see each other romantically and sexually until early 2008. By early 2008, Alexander was preparing for a business trip to Cancun and had invited another woman, Mimi Hall, to go with him. This reportedly upset Arias greatly. Their communications in the months before the murder included arguments about trust, jealousy, and emotional conflicts. Alexander told several friends that he feared Arias's behavior. He described incidents such as uninvited entries into his home, slashed tires, and other possessive acts. These accusations were never proven in court, but they contributed to the growing tension between them. In late May 2008, Arias rented a white Ford Focus in Redding, California, claiming she needed it for a long road trip. She also purchased gas cans, which would later become relevant evidence. She then began driving south, making her way through northern and southern California. Phone records would later show gaps in her calls and attempted alibis during this trip, evidence that prosecutors would argue showed she was trying to hide her movements. On June 4, 2008, Arias arrived at Alexander's home in Mesa, Arizona. The two spent the day together, which included sexual activity and taking photos of each other. Digital timestamps on recovered photographs would later confirm the exact timeline of that day. Later that afternoon, Alexander was attacked in the bathroom area of his home. The killing was extraordinarily brutal and involved multiple forms of violence. He suffered 27 stab wounds across his body. He was shot in the head with a .25 caliber pistol. His throat was cut so deeply it nearly severed his carotid artery. The medical examiner concluded that the throat wound was the fatal injury, though the exact sequence of injuries remains debated. The combination of stabbing, shooting, and cutting became central to discussions about the psychological nature of the crime and whether it showed rage, premeditation, or both. Alexander's friends became concerned when he missed important events over the next few days. On June 9, 2008, they entered his home and discovered his body in the shower. They immediately contacted police. The investigation quickly focused on Arias due to their prior relationship, jealousy conflicts, her sudden travel, and inconsistencies in her statements. But what really sealed the case against her was the physical evidence. Forensic investigators found her DNA mixed with Alexander's blood at the scene. A bloody palm print containing her DNA. Time-stamped photos of her and Alexander taken shortly before the killing. Photos of the actual attack that had been partially deleted, but were recovered by forensic experts. The key piece of evidence was a digital camera found in Alexander's washing machine. Arias had apparently tried to destroy it by running it through a wash cycle, but forensic technicians were able to recover the photos from the memory card. These photos created an exact timeline of what happened that day, including accidental photos taken during the attack itself. When police questioned Arias, her story changed repeatedly. First, she claimed she had not visited Alexander and was nowhere near Arizona. Then, when confronted with evidence placing her at the scene, she changed her story. She suggested that two masked intruders had broken in and attacked them both, and that she had fled in fear. Finally, when that story fell apart under scrutiny, she admitted to killing Alexander but claimed it was self-defense. Investigators considered these shifting stories to be significant indicators of deception. The intruder story had absolutely no evidence supporting it, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, nothing. And her self-defense claim conflicted with the extensive defensive wounds on Alexander's body and the logistics of the attack. How could it be self-defense when she stabbed him 27 times, shot him, and cut his throat? Arias was charged with first-degree murder, and her trial began in December 2012 in Maricopa County Superior Court. The prosecution's case focused on premeditation, jealousy, and Arias's attempts to cover her tracks. Evidence of premeditation included the gas cans she purchased, which prosecutors argued were used to avoid leaving a traceable record at gas stations. Her manipulation of phone records to create a false alibi, her removal and attempted destruction of the camera, her deletion of photos from the crime scene. The defense argued that Alexander had been abusive and that Arias had acted in self-defense, but they could not provide verified evidence of any abuse. During the trial, Arias made numerous media appearances, giving interviews where she made contradictory or provocative statements. She even did an interview with a local TV station just hours after being arrested, proclaiming her innocence. These appearances drew massive public attention and turned the trial into a media circus. On May 8, 2013, Jodie Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder. The penalty phase, where the jury decides between death and life imprisonment, lasted nearly 2 years due to jury deadlocks. The first jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision on sentencing. A second jury also deadlocked. Finally, in April 2015, the judge sentenced Arias to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As of now, Jodie Arias is alive and serving her sentence at Perryville Prison, part of the Arizona State Prison Complex. She will remain incarcerated for the rest of her life unless future legal developments alter her status, which is extremely unlikely. She has appealed her conviction multiple times. In 2020, the Arizona Court of Appeals upheld her conviction, though they did criticize some of the prosecutor's conduct during the trial. However, her life sentence remained intact. Since her incarceration, Arias has been involved in various prison disciplinary issues and has had communications restrictions placed on her. The case of Jodie Arias represents level 1 of the most shocking death row cases, because while her crime was brutal and premeditated, she ultimately avoided the death penalty. What makes her case particularly notable is the pattern of lies she told when confronted with overwhelming evidence. First, she wasn't there. Then, intruders did it. Then, it was self-defense. Each lie collapsed under the weight of forensic evidence, particularly those recovered photos that created an undeniable timeline. The brutality of Travis Alexander's death, 27 stab wounds, a gunshot, and a slashed throat, shocked the nation. But it was Arias's behavior afterward that made the case unforgettable. The elaborate lies, the media interviews, and her complete lack of credible remorse. Travis Alexander was just 30 years old when he died in his own bathroom, killed by a woman he had once cared for, but had been trying to distance himself from. His family had to sit through years of trials and appeals, hearing Arias blame their loved one for his own murder. Jodie Arias will spend the rest of her life behind bars, but she'll spend it alive. Unlike Travis Alexander, whose life was taken in one of the most violent domestic murders in Arizona history. If Jodie Arias's lies and violence shocked the nation, then our next case involves something even more incomprehensible. A family annihilator who destroyed everything he claimed to love, including his unborn child. Level 2. Chris Watts, Colorado. On the surface, Chris and Shanann Watts appeared to be living the American dream. A nice house in a suburban Colorado neighborhood, 2 beautiful young daughters, and a 3rd child on the way. Active social media accounts showing family trips, motivation, and love. But on August 13, 2018, that dream became a nightmare when Chris Watts murdered his entire family and disposed of their bodies at an oil site where he worked. And what makes this case even more chilling is how he did it, and how he tried to blame his pregnant wife for the deaths of their children. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in North Carolina. He grew up in what appeared to be a stable, middle-class household with both parents present. Watts attended Pine Forest High School and later went to the NASCAR Technical Institute, where he trained in automotive skills. He was described as introverted but polite, with no documented criminal behavior. He later moved to Colorado and worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, an oil company. Watts met Shanann Catherine Ruchek in 2010 through Facebook. They began dating soon after, and their relationship moved quickly. Watts and Shanann married in November 2012 and settled in Frederick, Colorado, a small town outside Denver. Their marriage appeared stable to the outside world, though later investigations would reveal periods of financial stress, communication issues, and emotional distance. Shanann was born on January 10, 1984, in New Jersey. She worked in various fields but eventually became a successful employee for the multi-level marketing company Thrive, also known as Lavelle. She was extremely active on social media, frequently posting about her family life, health routines, and motivational content. Shanann suffered from lupus, an autoimmune condition, but maintained an active lifestyle and work schedule despite her illness. The couple had 2 daughters, Bella Marie Watts, born in 2013, and Celeste Cece Catherine Watts, born in 2015. At the time of the murders, Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy they intended to name Nico. By 2015 and 2016, the Watts family faced significant financial challenges. They filed for bankruptcy in 2015, reporting substantial debt including mortgage payments, medical bills, and credit obligations. Despite Shanann's income from Thrive, their financial strain continued. In 2018, marital issues intensified. Shanann spent several weeks in North Carolina visiting family during the summer, while Chris remained in Colorado for work. During this time, Watts began an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. Phone records, emails, and testimony later confirmed that he frequently communicated with Kessinger and went to great lengths to conceal the relationship. Shanann grew suspicious of his emotional distance and questioned him about the state of their marriage. Text messages revealed arguments about his changed behavior, lack of affection, and decreasing involvement with the children. In early August 2018, while Shanann was still in North Carolina, she texted friends and family that she was worried about her marriage. She reported that Watts was acting strangely, avoiding intimacy, and expressing doubts about their relationship. When she returned to Colorado on August 7th, the tension continued. On August 13th, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip to Arizona around 1:48 a.m. She was dropped off by a friend named Nicole Atkinson, who was concerned about Shanann's well-being and the state of her marriage. Nicole would become one of the first people to suspect something was terribly wrong just hours later. According to Watts's later confession, what happened next occurred in the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018. Watts claimed an argument occurred after Shanann confronted him about their marriage and his suspected infidelity. During this confrontation, he strangled Shanann in their bedroom. The medical examiner later confirmed evidence consistent with manual strangulation. After killing Shanann, Watts placed her body in the back of his work truck. Then, and this is where the case becomes almost incomprehensible, he loaded their two daughters, Bella and Celeste, into the truck. The girls were alive at this point. He drove about 45 minutes to a remote oil site owned by his employer. At the site, he smothered 4-year-old Celeste first, then 3-year-old Bella. Bella reportedly fought back, based on injuries found during her autopsy. She had bite marks on her tongue, suggesting she was conscious and struggling as her father suffocated her. Both girls died from asphyxiation. Then Watts disposed of the bodies in the most horrific way imaginable. He buried Shanann's body, still carrying their unborn son, in a shallow grave near the oil tanks. He placed Bella and Celeste into separate oil tanks filled with crude oil. Their small bodies were submerged in oil for several days before being recovered. At 8 a.m. on August 13th, just hours after the murders, Nicole Atkinson tried to contact Shanann about missed appointments. When she couldn't reach her friend, Nicole drove to the Watts home. She became increasingly worried when Shanann didn't answer the door and eventually alerted law enforcement. Police performed a welfare check and contacted Chris Watts at work. He returned home and spoke with officers, but his behavior immediately raised red flags. Shanann's phone, purse, and medication, items she was known never to leave behind, were all found inside the house. Her car was in the garage. But Shanann and the girls were nowhere to be found. Police began interviewing Watts more intensively on August 14th. He gave multiple inconsistent explanations. First, he claimed he had no idea what happened. Then, he suggested Shanann had taken the kids and left after an argument. Later, he would claim that Shanann had killed the children, and he killed her in anger. His constantly changing stories immediately raised suspicion among investigators. The turning point came on August 15th when Watts agreed to take a polygraph test. He failed it spectacularly. Confronted by investigators with the results, he eventually confessed, but he offered a version of events that blamed Shanann. He claimed that he had told Shanann he wanted a separation, and she had responded by strangling the girls. He said he then killed Shanann in a rage. This story was contradicted by all the forensic evidence and was rejected by investigators and prosecutors. On November 6, 2018, Watts submitted a full guilty plea to avoid the death penalty. In February 2019, in a prison interview, he finally admitted the full truth. He had killed Shanann and both daughters himself. Autopsies for the victims revealed the full horror. Shanann showed evidence of manual strangulation and blunt force trauma consistent with being dragged. Bella had signs of a struggle, including bite marks on her tongue, and died from asphyxiation. Celeste also died from asphyxiation. Nico, the unborn baby, died as a result of his mother's death. The oil tank conditions caused additional tissue damage and decay, making some findings more difficult but not obscuring the causes of death. The case never went to trial because of Watts's plea agreement. Sentencing occurred on November 19, 2018, and Judge Marcelo Kopkow handed down 3 consecutive life sentences without parole for the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. 2 additional life sentences for unlawful termination of a pregnancy. 48 years for disposing of Shanann's body. 36 years total for disposing of the children's bodies. Judge Kopkow described the crimes as the most inhumane and vicious he had seen in his career. Watts's parents and Shanann's family both gave emotional statements during sentencing. Shanann's family explicitly rejected Watts's earlier claims that she had harmed the children. They called him a liar and a monster. As of now, Chris Watts is alive and serving his sentence at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He was transferred from Colorado for safety reasons, as his crimes made him a target for violence from other inmates. He has absolutely no possibility of parole. Since his incarceration, he has been placed under protective housing due to the nature of his crimes. He has admitted full responsibility in later interviews and has reportedly expressed remorse, though many question its sincerity. He has limited contact with outsiders and is unlikely to ever be moved to a less restrictive setting. He remains under constant security monitoring. The case of Chris Watts represents Level 2 because it involves the complete destruction of an entire family, including 2 young children and an unborn baby. What makes it particularly shocking is the premeditation involved. Watts had been planning to start a new life with his mistress and saw his family as obstacles to that plan. He didn't kill in a moment of rage. He methodically murdered his wife, then drove his daughters to a remote location and killed them one by one. The image of those 2 little girls, alive in the back of that truck, not knowing their father was about to murder them, haunts everyone who learns about this case. Bella was old enough to understand what was happening. She watched her sister die before her father killed her too. The disposal of their bodies in oil tanks added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in prison, but he'll spend it alive, unlike Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, whose lives he stole to pursue a relationship with another woman. Level 3. Richard Speck, Illinois. If Chris Watts killing his own family felt impossible to understand, imagine a stranger breaking into a home and spending 7 hours methodically murdering 8 young women, while one terrified survivor hid under a bed, listening to her friends die one by one. That's exactly what happened in Chicago on July 13, 1966, and the man who did it showed absolutely no remorse. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois. He was the 7th of 8 children in what seemed like a normal family, until his father died of a heart attack when Speck was just 6 years old. That's when everything fell apart. His mother remarried an alcoholic named Carl Lindbergh, who used to beat up Speck and his siblings regularly, and the stable home disappeared overnight. By 12, Speck began drinking. By 13, he was arrested for trespassing, and by 15, he was breaking into homes and forging checks. School was a disaster. He failed 9th grade and dropped out completely. Throughout his teens and 20s, he bounced between manual labor jobs, never keeping one for long. Between 1955 and 1966, police arrested him over and over: burglary, assault, forgery, disturbing the peace. In 1965, he went to prison for forging checks, but got out on parole in early 1966. His record showed a clear pattern. He was getting more violent. After his release, Speck tried living with his wife and daughter in Texas, but his drinking and violent temper destroyed the marriage, and she divorced him in January 1966. 3 months later, in April 1966, Speck attacked a woman with a carving knife and robbed her home. Police issued a warrant for his arrest, and he ran. Traveled through the Midwest, working on cargo ships when he could find work. In April 1966, he attacked another woman with a knife but wasn't caught. By July 1966, he'd made it to Chicago, staying at a Salvation Army lodge for homeless men. Speck was drinking heavily, angry, and dangerous. The next of his victims were student nurses at South Chicago Community Hospital, who shared a townhouse on East 100th Street, a safe neighborhood where young professional women could focus on their medical training. On the night of July 13, 1966, 8 of them were home: Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Jo Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Marianne Jordan, Merlita Gargulo, and Valentina Passion. There was also a 9th woman, Corazon Amurao, aged 23. She would be the only one to survive. On July 13, 1966, Speck spent the day and evening at the bar drinking after failing to find work as a seaman. Around 11 p.m., he approached the nurse's townhouse, broke in through an unlocked window or door. Investigators were never completely sure which. He had a knife, and what happened next lasted 7 hours. Speck controlled the women through fear and threats. He tied them up with torn bedsheets and told them he only wanted money. He moved them between rooms throughout the townhouse. Then he started killing them. One by one. He would take a woman to another room, assault and murder her, then come back for the next. Some he strangled with his hands, some he stabbed. Some he beat to death, and some he strangled with torn fabric. The crime scene showed he did this systematically, removing victims one at a time and killing them individually over several hours. But he didn't see Corazon Amurao. She had rolled under a bed and stayed there, completely silent and hidden in the dark. In the chaos, Speck apparently lost count of how many women were in the house. Amurao stayed under that bed for hours. She heard her friends screaming. She heard them begging for their lives. She heard them die. And she stayed frozen, terrified, barely breathing until Speck finally left around 6 a.m. Another nurse who lived elsewhere arrived that morning for a planned outing. She found the door open and walked inside. What she saw was unimaginable. She called police immediately. When investigators arrived, they found 8 young women murdered throughout the townhouse. Rooms had been ransacked. Torn bedsheets and clothing showed how victims had been tied up. There was evidence of sexual assault on some victims, and there were fingerprints everywhere. Within hours, the story was national news. This wasn't one murder, or even 2. This was the slaughter of 8 innocent young women in a single night. The key to solving the case was Corazon Amurao. Despite her terror, she gave police a detailed description of Speck's face, voice, and clothing. She also described one detail that would prove crucial: a tattoo on his left arm that read, "Born to Raise Hell." Police worked with a sketch artist to create a drawing of the killer. That sketch appeared in Chicago newspapers on July 15th, and within 24 hours, a doctor called police. He'd treated a patient matching that description at a hospital just hours earlier for a self-inflicted injury. Speck, seeing his face all over the news, had tried to kill himself on July 16th by slashing his wrists at a boarding house. The owner found him bleeding and called for help. Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital. While doctors treated his wounds, a physician noticed the tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell." It matched the survivor's description exactly. He also called police immediately. Richard Speck was arrested at the hospital on July 17, 1966. He gave minimal statements and refused to confess in writing, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Before trial, psychiatrists evaluated Speck multiple times. They found he had severe personality problems, was addicted to alcohol, had no impulse control, and showed absolutely no remorse. But they also found that he wasn't insane. He knew exactly what he'd done, and the court ruled he was fit to stand trial. The trial started on April 3, 1967, in Peoria, Illinois. It had been moved from Chicago because the case was too famous for a fair trial there. The evidence was crushing. Corazon Amurao identified him in court. His fingerprints were all over the crime scene, items at the scene linked directly to him, and medical examiners confirmed the brutal nature of each murder. On April 15, 1967, Richard Speck was found guilty on all 8 counts of murder and was sentenced to death. But he never faced execution. In 1971, the Supreme Court changed rules about the death penalty, and in 1972, Speck's death sentence was changed to 400 to 1,200 years in prison. Basically, life without any chance of release. Speck served his time at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His prison record was terrible. Constant rule violations, illegal activities, and allegations of drug use. There were also widespread but unproven stories about his involvement in prison prostitution. Then, in 1996, 5 years after his death, a videotape surfaced. It had been secretly recorded in prison during the 1980s. The tape showed Speck using drugs and displaying physical changes from female hormones, though how he got them was unclear. In the video, he made disturbing statements about the murders and showed zero remorse. When families of the victims saw that tape, it reopened all their pain. Richard Speck died on December 5, 1991, one day before his 50th birthday. He had a heart attack while in prison and was rushed to Silver Cross Hospital in Joliet, Illinois, where he died. There was no foul play. He died of natural causes after serving 25 years behind bars. He never apologized. He never explained why he did it. He never showed any real remorse for murdering 8 young women. The case represents Level 3 because it involved the systematic murder of 8 victims in a single night. Young women targeted simply because they were there. Unlike Jodie Arias, who killed in jealousy, or Chris Watts, who killed his own family, Speck was a stranger who broke into a home and slaughtered 8 innocent people over several hours. The image of Corazon Amurao hiding under that bed, listening to her friends die one by one, knowing she'd be next if she made a sound, haunts everyone who learns about this case. She survived by pure luck. Speck lost count. Gloria Davy was training to save lives. Patricia Matusek had just turned 20. Nina Jo Schmale was engaged. Pamela Wilkening was planning her future. Suzanne, Marianne, Merlita, and Valentina all had families, dreams, and careers ahead of them. Richard Speck took all of that in one night. He spent 25 years in prison, but he spent them alive, unlike the 8 young women whose lives he ended in that Chicago townhouse. The murder of 8 student nurses in one night seems like the worst a psychopath could do. But for the next case, a man tortured and killed 33 young men over 6 years, and buried most of them under his own house while throwing parties for his neighbors. Level 4. John Wayne Gacy, Illinois. When neighbors think of the friendly guy next door who performs as a clown at children's parties and helps with community fundraisers, they definitely don't imagine a serial killer, but that's exactly what John Wayne Gacy was. Beneath his house, police would discover a crawl space packed with the remains of 29 young men and boys. By the end of the investigation, the count reached 33 victims. And throughout all those years of killing, Gacy had been the last person anyone suspected, a pillar of the community, well-liked, successful, and helpful. He'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children. His father was an auto mechanic and World War I veteran with a serious drinking problem and a violent temper. He used to beat the entire family regularly and screamed insults at his children constantly. His mother tried to protect them but couldn't always stop the abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for his father's approval but never received it. His father called him weak, questioned his masculinity, and made him feel worthless. Gacy also had health problems. He had a heart condition that kept him from playing sports, which made him a target for bullies. He was overweight and unathletic. Kids made fun of him. His father made fun of him. Despite all this, Gacy didn't show violent behavior as a child. His grades were average, and he just seemed like a kid trying to survive a terrible home situation. In 1964, Gacy married Marlyn Myers and moved to Iowa to manage his father-in-law's restaurant. He joined a local community service group and became popular in the area. Everyone thought he was a great guy. But behind closed doors, he was sexually abusing teenage boys who worked at the restaurant. In 1968, he was charged with assaulting a 15-year-old boy. He pleaded guilty and went to prison for 10 years. His wife divorced him immediately. Incredibly, Gacy got out after only 18 months for good behavior. After his release in 1970, he moved back to Chicago and lived with his mother. Within 2 years, he'd remarried, this time to Carol Hoff, and started his own construction business called PDM Contractors. The business did well and hired teenage boys and young men for temporary work. Gacy got involved in local politics with the Democratic Party. He created a clown character called Pogo the Clown and performed at children's hospitals and fundraising events. He was friendly, helpful, and respected. Nobody knew he was already killing. His second marriage fell apart between 1972 and 1978. His wife later said he became controlling and distant. They divorced in 1976. After that, Gacy lived alone in his house in Norwood Park Township, and that's when the killing really accelerated. Gacy targeted teenage boys and young men, usually between 14 and 21. Many were runaways, drifters, or temporary workers for his construction company, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or investigated thoroughly. His method was disturbingly consistent. He'd lure victims to his home by offering them construction work, inviting them for drinks, or just offering to help them. Once inside, he'd restrain them using handcuffs, often as part of what he called a magic trick. Then he'd sexually assault them. Then he'd kill them, usually by strangulation using a rope that he twisted tighter and tighter until they died. After killing them, he'd bury the bodies in the crawl space under his house. When that space filled up, he started dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. For 6 years, nobody caught him. The investigation that finally exposed Gacy started on December 11, 1978, with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert P. Est. Robert was a responsible kid who worked at a pharmacy. That evening, he told his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a summer job and would be right back. He never came home. His mother called police immediately. Detectives quickly learned the contractor Robert mentioned was John Wayne Gacy. When they interviewed him, his answers didn't add up. Then they discovered his 1968 conviction for assaulting a teenager. Their suspicions grew. They assigned officers to watch him. On December 13, 1978, police got a warrant and searched Gacy's home. They found disturbing items, driver's licenses and IDs belonging to young men who weren't Gacy, handcuffs, police badges, clothing too small for Gacy's size, a high school ring that wasn't his, and sexual materials involving young males. But they didn't find bodies. The concrete floors and structure of the house hid what was underneath. Over the next week, surveillance officers watched as Gacy's behavior became more erratic. He drank heavily, drove recklessly, and seemed to be falling apart. On December 20th, 1978, Gacy confessed to his lawyers that he'd killed more than 30 young men. His lawyers immediately contacted police. That same day, police got a second, more detailed warrant. On December 21st, 1978, investigators entered Gacy's home and started digging in the crawl space beneath the house. What they found was beyond comprehension. Human remains everywhere. Over the following weeks and months, teams carefully recovered 29 bodies from the crawl space. 4 more bodies were later found in the Des Plaines River and other locations. Total, 33 victims. Many bodies were so badly decayed that identifying them was extremely difficult. Several victims remained unidentified for decades until DNA technology finally gave them their names back between 2011 and 2021. Gacy had buried most victims in the crawl space, arranging bodies in specific areas, and sometimes stacking them when he ran out of room. When the space was completely full, he disposed of later victims in the river instead. Examinations confirmed that most victims died from strangulation. Many showed evidence of sexual assault, restraints, and prolonged suffering. Personal items recovered from Gacy's home helped identify some victims. Many families had reported their sons missing years earlier, but those investigations had gone nowhere. Now they finally had answers. John Wayne Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder. His trial began on February 6, 1980 in Cook County, Illinois. His lawyers tried an insanity defense, claiming he had multiple personalities and a violent alternate personality committed the murders. Psychiatrists confirmed Gacy had severe personality problems, but said he was legally sane and fully aware of his actions. The evidence against him was crushing. Human remains all over his property, his own confession statements, items belonging to dead victims found in his home, and testimony from people who'd escaped earlier attacks. On March 12, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all 33 counts. The next day, he was sentenced to death for 12 murders and life in prison for the rest. His appeals lasted 14 years. During that time at Menard Correctional Center, Gacy painted artwork that later became controversial when people bought it. He did interviews where he denied everything and showed no real remorse. He filed legal challenge after legal challenge. None worked. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. He was 52 years old. His reported last words were, "Kiss my ass," though accounts vary. After his death, his brain was removed and given to a psychiatrist who'd interviewed him extensively. She studied it for abnormalities that might explain his behavior. She found none. His remains were cremated and disposed of. The case represents Level 4 because it involves not just multiple murders, but systematic hunting and killing over 6 years. Unlike Speck, who committed mass murder in one night, Gacy hunted, tortured, and killed dozens of victims over time, burying most beneath his house while maintaining a public image as a friendly community member. He performed as a clown for children while bodies decomposed in his crawl space, hosted neighborhood parties while young men's remains lay just feet below his guests, and he shook hands with politicians while continuing to lure vulnerable boys to their deaths. What makes this especially disturbing is how long he got away with it, and how many lives could have been saved if his 1968 conviction had been taken more seriously. Robert Piest was 15 years old Excited about a possible summer job, he told his mom he'd be right back. He never came home. And he was just one of 33. John Wayne Gacy was executed in 1994, but he lived far longer than any of his victims. If 29 bodies buried under a suburban home feels like the darkest possible evil, then our next case, Level 5, involves someone even more infamous. A serial killer so charming that he became the template for how we think about dangerous charisma, whose name is still synonymous with evil 35 years after his death. Level 5. Ted Bundy, multiple states. There's a reason Ted Bundy's name became shorthand for charming serial killer. It's because he actually was exactly that. Intelligent, well-spoken, polite, and handsome. He volunteered at a crisis hotline helping people in emotional distress. He worked on political campaigns. He was studying to become a lawyer. He was the kind of man parents would approve of their daughters dating. And he used every bit of that charm to lure at least 30 young women to horrible deaths across multiple states. What separates Bundy from someone like Gacy isn't just the number of victims. It's that Bundy operated in broad daylight, in public places, using nothing but charisma and cleverness. He didn't need to hide in the shadows. He walked right up to his victims in crowded areas and they trusted him. And by the time police finally caught him, he'd left a trail of bodies from Washington to Florida. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His early life was built on a lie that would shape everything that followed. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, wasn't married when she got pregnant, a situation that carried serious social shame in the 1940s. To avoid scandal, young Ted was raised believing his mother was actually his older sister, and his grandparents were his parents. This kind of family secret was common back then, but it created a foundation of confusion and instability that Bundy would reference later in interviews. In 1950, Eleanor moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, and eventually married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who gave Ted his last name. But Bundy never developed a real relationship with his stepfather. He was shy, socially awkward, and struggled to make friends during his teenage years. He felt like an outsider looking in at normal life. Despite his social struggles, Bundy did reasonably well in school. He eventually enrolled at the University of Washington to study psychology. Over time, he learned to fake the social behaviors that made him seem confident and likable, even though he later admitted feeling disconnected from real human emotion. He got skilled at appearing trustworthy, respectable, and charming. He volunteered at a Seattle crisis hotline where he worked on political campaigns. He was exactly the type of young man people described as having a bright future. But underneath that carefully built image, something much darker was growing. As a teenager, Bundy engaged in voyeurism and broke into homes, though he was never caught. Later assessments and his own statements suggested he had violent fantasies about control and domination from a young age. In 1967, Bundy started dating a woman known publicly as Stephanie Brooks. She was attractive, sophisticated, and from a wealthy family. Everything Bundy wanted to be associated with. When she broke up with him in 1968 because she felt he lacked direction, it devastated him. Then, years later, after Bundy had transformed his image and become more confident, they briefly reconnected. This time, Bundy suddenly ended the relationship himself, apparently to prove he had control, that he could reject her the way she'd rejected him. This need for control and power over women would define everything that came next. Bundy's confirmed murders started in 1974, though he hinted at killing as early as 1969. His victims fit a clear pattern. White females, typically 15 to 25 years old, often with long dark hair parted in the middle. Many looked strikingly similar to Stephanie Brooks, His method was as calculated as it was effective. He'd approach women in public places during the day, college campuses, parks, and shopping areas. He used different tricks to gain their trust. Sometimes he wore a fake cast or sling and asked for help carrying books or loading something into his car. Sometimes he pretended to be a police officer or authority figure. Sometimes he just used his good looks and charm. Once he got a victim to his car, a tan Volkswagen Beetle, he'd knock them unconscious, usually with a crowbar or tire iron. Then he'd drive to a secluded spot where he'd sexually assault, torture, and murder them. Most died from either head injuries or strangulation. Disturbingly, Bundy often returned to dump sites days or weeks later for sexual acts with the decomposing bodies. He sometimes took photos, though most were never found. In early 1974, several young women started disappearing around Seattle. Linda Ann Healy vanished from her bedroom in January, leaving behind a blood-stained pillowcase. Susan Rancourt disappeared from campus in April. Roberta Parks vanished in May. Brenda Ball disappeared in June. Georgianne Hawkins disappeared from the University of Washington campus, also in June. Then came July 14, 1974, the day that gave investigators their first real break. At Lake Sammamish State Park, two women disappeared within hours, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Multiple witnesses saw a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, calling himself Ted, approaching women and asking for help loading a sailboat. Witnesses described him, his tan Volkswagen Beetle, and even heard the name Ted. For the first time, investigators had a description, but it still wasn't enough to find him. In fall 1974, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City for law school. The Washington disappearances stopped, but new disappearances began in Utah and Colorado. Nancy Wilcox vanished in October. Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a police chief, disappeared that same month. Laura Aim disappeared in October. Deborah Kent vanished from a high school parking lot in November. Bundy was finally arrested on August 16, 1975, but not for murder. A highway patrol officer in Utah noticed his Volkswagen driving suspiciously through a neighborhood late at night. When the officer tried pulling him over, Bundy fled before finally stopping. The officer searched the car and found what he described as a murder kit: handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, an ice pick, a crowbar, and trash bags. Bundy claimed these were ordinary items, but nobody believed him. When investigators examined the car more closely, they found hair-matching missing women and other evidence linking Bundy to disappearances. In 1976, he was convicted of kidnapping Carol DeRanch, a woman who'd escaped from him in 1974 after he impersonated a police officer. In 1977, Bundy was sent to Colorado to face murder charges. During pretrial hearings in Aspen, where he was representing himself, he was allowed to use the courthouse law library. On June 7, 1977, during a break, Bundy jumped from a second-story window and escaped. He was caught 6 days later. Then, on December 30, 1977, Bundy escaped again, this time from jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He'd sawed through his cell ceiling, crawled through, and simply walked out. By the time guards noticed, he was already heading to Florida, and the worst was yet to come. After escaping in December 1977, Bundy traveled to Tallahassee, Florida, living under a fake name. On January 15, 1978, just over 2 weeks after his escape, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University around 3 a.m. In less than 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women with a wooden club. Margaret Bowman, 21, was beaten to death. Lisa Levy, 20, was beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, and bitten repeatedly. Karen Chandler survived with severe injuries. Kathy Kleiner survived with a broken jaw. That same night, Bundy attacked another student, Cheryl Thomas, in her apartment just blocks away. She survived but suffered permanent hearing loss. Then, on February 9, 1978, Bundy committed his final known murder. He kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found 8 weeks later. She'd been sexually assaulted and murdered. Bundy was arrested for the last time on February 15, 1978, in Pensacola after being stopped for driving a stolen car. He gave a false name, but fingerprints confirmed who he was. This time, the evidence was overwhelming, especially the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body, which experts matched to casts of Bundy's teeth. Bundy faced 3 major trials in Florida. In 1979, he was tried for the Chi Omega murders. He represented himself at times, questioning witnesses and making arguments. On July 24, 1979, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. In 1980, he was tried for Kimberly Leach's murder. Again, guilty and another death sentence. After his convictions, Bundy spent over a decade on death row, filing appeals and giving interviews where he slowly started admitting to some murders, though he continued manipulating and lying even in confession. Days before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 murders, though investigators believe the actual number could be much higher, possibly over 100. Theodore Robert Bundy was executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and cheering when his death was announced. His remains were cremated and his ashes scattered in Washington's Cascade Mountains, the same area where he dumped many victims' bodies. The case represents Level 5 because it involves not just a high victim count, but intelligence, manipulation, and charm that let him evade capture for years. Unlike Gacy, who targeted vulnerable boys, Bundy targeted educated middle-class women in public during daylight. He escaped custody twice, represented himself in court, questioning survivors of his attacks, and he maintained innocence for years while hinting at guilt. He became the template for the charismatic psychopath, the intelligent, attractive killer who doesn't look like a monster. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Linda Ann Healy was studying psychology. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were excited college students. Kimberly Leach was just 12 years old. Ted Bundy took all their futures in the most brutal ways, and he did it with a smile. He was executed in 1989, but unlike his victims, he lived long enough to become famous, to give interviews, to try explaining himself. His victims never got that chance. His real legacy isn't his intelligence or escapes or courtroom drama. It's the 30-plus young women whose lives he stole, women who trusted the wrong, charming stranger on the wrong day. Level 6. Jeffrey Dahmer, Wisconsin. If Ted Bundy represented the charming predator who hunted across state lines, then Jeffrey Dahmer represents something even more disturbing, a killer who didn't hunt at all. He lured his victims willingly into his apartment, drugged them, murdered them, and then kept their bodies as company. And what he did with those bodies went far beyond anything we've discussed so far. When police finally entered apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee on July 22, 1991, they discovered one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. What they found wasn't just evidence of murder. It was evidence of something much darker. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His early childhood seemed normal enough. His father, Lionel, was a chemist and graduate student. His mother, Joyce, struggled with mental health issues and took various medications during her pregnancy. As a young child, Dahmer was described as happy and energetic. But something changed around age 6 after he underwent surgery for a double hernia. Family members later said he became more withdrawn and quiet after that, though it's impossible to know if the surgery itself caused any personality change or if other factors were involved. His parents' marriage was troubled. They fought constantly, and the tension in the home was obvious. When Dahmer was in his early teens, his mother's mental health deteriorated further, and the family atmosphere became increasingly unstable. Around this time, Dahmer developed a disturbing fascination with dead animals. He collected roadkill and animal carcasses from the woods near his home. He would dissect them, studying their insides with intense curiosity. He later claimed he was interested in how things worked internally, how bones fit together, how bodies were structured. His father, being a chemist, had taught him how to use chemicals to bleach and preserve bones. Dahmer took this knowledge and applied it to his animal experiments. Nobody recognized this as a warning sign at the time. By high school, Dahmer was drinking heavily, often showing up to class drunk. He was a loner with few friends. Other students later described him as odd and isolated. Despite his problems, he managed to graduate in 1978. That summer, shortly after graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. He was 18 years old and living alone temporarily while his parents were going through a divorce. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old who was traveling to a concert. Dahmer invited him back to his house to drink and hang out. After several hours, when Hicks said he needed to leave, Dahmer didn't want him to go, so he hit him in the head with a dumbbell, strangled him, and killed him. Afterward, Dahmer dismembered the body in his basement, packed the parts into garbage bags, and buried them in the woods behind the house. Years later, he returned to the site, dug up the bones, crushed them with a sledgehammer, and scattered them. Stephen Hicks's disappearance was never solved at the time, and Dahmer wouldn't kill again for nearly 9 years. After high school, Dahmer briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out due to his drinking. His father, frustrated with his behavior, convinced him to join the Army in 1979. Dahmer was stationed in Germany as a medical specialist, but his drinking problem continued. He was discharged in 1981 for alcohol abuse. He moved to Wisconsin to live with his grandmother in the Milwaukee suburb of West Allis. For several years, he seemed to function relatively normally, though he was arrested a few times for minor offenses like public drunkenness and indecent exposure. But in 1987, Dahmer killed again. This time, it was Stephen Twomey, a 25-year-old man he met at a bar. Dahmer later claimed he didn't remember killing Twomey, that he woke up in a hotel room and found him dead. Whether that's true or not, he dismembered the body, disposed of it in trash bags, and got away with it. From that point on, the killings accelerated. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer murdered at least 15 more men and boys, most of them in his apartment. His victims were primarily young men, many from marginalized communities. Gay men, men of color, some who were homeless or struggling. He often met them at gay bars, bus stops, or shopping centers. His method was disturbingly consistent. He'd approach someone, usually offering money for photos or just to hang out. He'd bring them back to his apartment, give them a drink laced with sleeping pills, and wait for them to pass out. Then he'd strangle them. But what happened after the murders is what separates Dahmer from almost every other killer we've discussed. He didn't just kill his victims, he kept them. He took Polaroid photos of the bodies at various stages of dismemberment. He kept skulls, which he cleaned and painted. He stored body parts in his refrigerator and freezer. He dissolved some remains in acid-filled barrels. And in several cases, he admitted to eating parts of his victims. Hearts, thighs, biceps, because he said it made him feel like they were still with him, that they'd become a permanent part of him. He also conducted disturbing experiments on some victims while they were still alive but drugged. He drilled holes into their skulls and poured acid or boiling water into their brains, attempting to create what he called living zombies, people who would be completely obedient and never leave him. These experiments were always fatal. The most disturbing near-miss came on May 27, 1991, when 14-year-old Konarak Synthesomphone escaped from Dahmer's apartment and was found wandering naked, bleeding, and incoherent on the street. Neighbors called police. When officers arrived, Dahmer came outside and calmly explained that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they'd had a fight, and everything was fine. Despite the boy's obvious distress and the neighbors' protests, police believed Dahmer and helped him take Konarak back inside the apartment. Within hours, Dahmer murdered him. Had police investigated further, had they entered the apartment, they would have found evidence of previous murders, including another victim's body still in the bedroom. But they didn't check. They took Dahmer's word and left. That decision haunted those officers for the rest of their lives. Dahmer's crimes finally came to light on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, escaped from Dahmer's apartment with a handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down a police car and told officers a man had tried to kill him. Edwards led police back to apartment 213. When officers knocked, Dahmer answered calmly and let them inside. As they looked around, one officer opened the refrigerator. Inside was a human head. That's when everything unraveled. A full search of the apartment revealed unimaginable horror. Police found 7 skulls scattered throughout the apartment, some painted, some bleached. A blue 57-gallon drum contained a human torso dissolving in acid. The refrigerator held 2 human hearts, along with other organs and muscle tissue wrapped in plastic. The freezer was packed with bags of human flesh. There were 3 more dismembered torsos in various states of decay. There were tools, saws, knives, bleach, formaldehyde, acid. There were photographs documenting every stage of the killings and dismemberments. And there were drawings. Sketches Dahmer had made of a proposed shrine he wanted to build using the skulls and bones of his victims. Dahmer was arrested immediately. Once in custody, he didn't resist or deny anything. He confessed fully and in disturbing detail to 17 murders committed between 1978 and 1991. He walked detectives through each killing chronologically, explaining what he'd done and why. He said he killed because he didn't want his victims to leave. He said he kept their bodies because he was lonely and wanted company. He said he ate parts of them because it made him feel connected to them. Psychiatrists evaluated Dahmer extensively. They diagnosed him with several severe disorders, including attraction to dead bodies, personality disorders, and alcohol dependence. But the key legal question was whether he was sane. Some experts said his behavior was so bizarre it proved severe mental illness. Others argued he was completely aware of what he was doing, that he planned carefully, hid evidence effectively, and understood the legal consequences. Ultimately, he was found legally sane and responsible for his actions. Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of first-degree murder in Wisconsin. A separate case in Ohio later covered Stephen Hicks's murder. His trial began on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee. The trial wasn't about whether he killed these people. He'd already confessed. The trial was about whether he was insane when he did it. The prosecution argued he was methodical, calculating, and in full control. The defense argued his cannibalism and experiments proved he was psychotic. Families of victims attended every day, sitting through horrifying testimony about what had been done to their loved ones. On February 15, 1992, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty on all counts. He received 15 consecutive life sentences in Wisconsin, totaling 957 years. Later, he received an additional life sentence in Ohio for Stephen Hicks's murder. Because Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty, execution wasn't an option. He was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. For the first year, Dahmer was kept in solitary confinement for his own protection. In 1993, he was moved to a less restrictive unit where he could interact with other prisoners. He participated in Bible study and was baptized. He worked cleaning duties. But other inmates harassed him constantly, and he reportedly made jokes about his crimes, which made things worse. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to clean the prison gym with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Guards left them unsupervised briefly. During that time, Scarver attacked Dahmer with a metal bar from exercise equipment, striking him repeatedly in the head and face. Dahmer died from his injuries at a nearby hospital. He was 34 years old. Scarver later said he killed Dahmer because he was disgusted by his crimes and the way Dahmer behaved in prison. Anderson, who was also attacked, died shortly after. Dahmer's body was cremated, and his ashes were divided between his parents. After his death, the Oxford Apartments building where he'd committed most of his murders was demolished in 1992. Many of his belongings were destroyed. The 57-gallon drum was melted down. His brain was preserved temporarily for research, but after legal disputes, it was eventually cremated as well. The case triggered national discussions about police negligence, especially the Konarak incident, about how marginalized communities are often overlooked by law enforcement, and about the nature of severe mental illness versus legal responsibility. The case represents level 6 because it goes beyond the act of killing into something darker, keeping victims' bodies, eating parts of them, attempting to create living zombies. Unlike Bundy or Gacy, who disposed of bodies to avoid detection, Dahmer kept his victims close because he couldn't bear to be alone. 17 young men and boys lost their lives: Stephen Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, Jamie Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Konarak Synthesomphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. They were sons, brothers, friends, people with futures that were stolen not just by murder, but by something far more disturbing. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison in 1994, but he lived far longer than any of his victims ever got the chance to. If Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes felt like the absolute limit of human depravity, then our final case will challenge that assumption, because it involves a man who claims to have murdered over 300 young girls across 3 countries, and who, unbelievably, is possibly still alive and free today. Level 7, Pedro Lopez, South America. Most serial killers in this series were eventually caught, tried, and either executed or sentenced to life in prison without parole. Justice, however delayed, was ultimately served. But what happens when a serial killer, one who may be the most prolific in recorded history, serves only 14 years in prison and then simply disappears? That's the terrifying reality of Pedro Alonso Lopez, known throughout South America as the Monster of the Andes. He confessed to murdering over 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Police confirmed at least 110 of those murders. He was convicted, sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time, 16 years, and then released for good behavior. And since 1997, nobody knows where he is. He could be dead, he could be in hiding, or he could still be out there. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in Tolima, Colombia, one of 13 children. His father was killed during a period of intense civil violence in Colombia known as La Violencia, before Pedro was even born. His mother, Benilda, worked as a prostitute to support the family, and they lived in extreme poverty. Lopez later claimed his mother was physically abusive, and the home environment was chaotic and violent. According to his own accounts, given during police interviews and later to journalists, his mother caught him in a sexual situation with his younger sister when he was around 8 years old. She then threw him out of the house. At 8 years old, Pedro was living on the streets of Bogotá, Colombia's capital. He survived by stealing, begging, and sleeping in alleys. And while homeless, he claimed he was repeatedly sexually abused by older men, experiences he would later reference as formative to his hatred and violence toward others. As a teenager, Lopez wandered between cities. At one point, an American couple reportedly tried to help him, taking him in and offering him a home. He ran away after stealing from them. By his late teens, he'd turned to more serious crime. He was eventually arrested for stealing a car and sent to prison in Colombia. That's where, according to Lopez, things got worse. While in prison, he claimed he was gang-raped by a group of inmates. In interviews, he said he later killed 3 of those men inside the prison as revenge. There's no complete public documentation confirming those killings, but the story appears consistently in official accounts and interviews. After his release in the early 1970s, Lopez began traveling extensively across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He moved constantly, using buses, markets, and rural communities to find victims and avoid detection. And that's when the killing began. Lopez targeted young girls, usually between 8 and 12 years old. He focused on children from poor families in busy public places, open-air markets, bus stations, rural paths. These were areas where a missing child might not be reported immediately, or where reports might not be taken seriously by authorities. His method, reconstructed later from confessions and police investigations, was disturbingly simple. He would approach a girl in a public place. He'd gain her trust with small gifts, offers of food, or promises to help her. Then he'd lead her away to a secluded area outside town. Fields, ravines, isolated paths. There, he would sexually assault her. Then he would strangle her. Then he would bury or leave the body in a shallow grave or hidden location. Lopez told investigators he preferred areas with heavy seasonal rains or flooding, which would quickly erode and scatter remains, making discovery and identification much harder. He claimed he started killing in Colombia, then moved to Peru, and later Ecuador, adapting to local conditions but keeping the same basic pattern. In the late 1970s, Lopez was caught in Peru after trying to abduct a girl from an indigenous community in the Ayacucho region. Villagers apprehended him and suspected him of killing children in the area. They beat him severely and were preparing to execute him themselves. A Catholic missionary intervened, convincing the villagers not to kill him. Lopez was handed over to Peruvian authorities. But instead of prosecuting him for murder, Peruvian police simply expelled him across the border into Colombia. They didn't formally charge him. They didn't hold him long term, they just sent him away. That decision would prove catastrophic. After being expelled, Lopez traveled into Ecuador and continued killing. Throughout the late 1970s, Ecuadorian authorities recorded a growing number of missing girls from poor families. Many families reported daughters vanishing from markets or while running errands, but these disappearances were initially treated as isolated incidents, runaways, kidnappings for trafficking, or accidents. Nobody connected them. Then, around 1980, heavy rains and flooding in the Ambato region of Ecuador exposed several shallow graves. Bodies of young girls were discovered. Police realized there was a pattern. A focused investigation began. In March 1980, A woman in Ambato reported that a man had tried to lure her 12-year-old daughter from a market with promises of gifts. Police responded quickly and arrested the suspect, Pedro Alonso Lopez. At first, Lopez denied everything, but during interrogation, including one session where a female investigator posed as a grieving mother, Lopez broke down emotionally and began confessing. He offered to show police where he'd buried victims. Over the following days and weeks, Lopez led investigators to numerous grave sites in rural areas around Ambato. Authorities recovered body after body. In Ecuador alone, they were able to link him to at least 53 bodies through physical recoveries he guided them to. But the confessions didn't stop there. During interrogations and later interviews with journalists, Lopez claimed he'd killed approximately 110 girls in Ecuador, around 100 in Colombia, and roughly 100 in Peru, totaling over 300 murders. Only a portion could be confirmed with physical evidence, but even the conservative confirmed numbers made him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Ecuadorian and Colombian authorities cross-checked his descriptions of locations with missing person reports. Many matched, but the remoteness of some areas and the condition of remains made it impossible to identify every victim or confirm every claim. Lopez was charged and tried in Ecuador for the murders committed there. He was found guilty of 110 murders after the court accepted recovered bodies, confessions, and supporting evidence. Here's where the story takes an almost unbelievable turn. At that time, Ecuadorian law placed a maximum limit on prison sentences regardless of the number of crimes committed. The maximum sentence was 16 years. There was no death penalty in Ecuador. So, despite being convicted of 110 murders, despite confessing to over 300, Pedro Lopez received the maximum legal sentence, 16 years in prison. He was sent to Garcia Moreno Prison in Quito, Ecuador, where he reportedly behaved relatively well. He participated in religious activities. He claimed he had repented. There were no major disciplinary incidents. Because of good behavior, he was released early in 1994, after serving only about 14 years. Let that sink in. 14 years for at least 110 confirmed murders. Immediately upon release, Ecuador expelled Lopez to Colombia, where authorities suspected him in numerous unsolved child murders from the 1970s. Colombian officials ordered a psychiatric evaluation. He was found to have severe personality problems but was considered mentally competent and aware of his actions. Instead of charging him immediately, they placed him in a psychiatric facility for observation. He remained there for about 3 years. Then, in 1997, doctors concluded Lopez no longer met the legal criteria for forced detention. He was released under conditions that reportedly included regular check-ins with authorities and some level of monitoring. After a short time, Lopez stopped reporting. He disappeared. In the early 2000s, Colombian police linked him to the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl and issued an arrest warrant, but he was never found. As of today, there is no confirmed public record of his death. There are no verified sightings. There's no documentation of his current whereabouts. If he's alive, he would be in his late 70s. Some reports and rumors claim he may have died, but none have been confirmed with official documentation or reliable sources. He is officially wanted by Colombian authorities, but that's all we know. The case of Pedro Lopez represents Level 7, the final level, not just because of the sheer number of victims, but because of what it represents: the complete failure of multiple justice systems. He was caught in Peru and released. He was convicted in Ecuador and served only 14 years. He was released in Colombia and disappeared, and today he could still be out there. Over 300 young girls, daughters, sisters, children with names and families, lost their lives to this man. Most were never identified. Most were buried in unmarked graves in remote areas. Most of their families never got answers, and the man who took them served 14 years and walked free. That's the most terrifying part of this story. Not just what he did, but that the system let him go. Pedro Alonso Lopez may be the most prolific serial killer in modern history, and unlike every other person in this series, unlike Arias, Watts, Speck, Gacy, Bundy, or Dahmer, he might still be alive. And if he is, nobody knows where.